Well, hello class. Welcome to week number 3 here in our 8-week endeavor to study film, its influence on culture, how it influences culture, and also how it developed as an art form. I hope you're enjoying your class. I have been enjoying reading a lot of your discussions online, and as well as getting to know some of you through email. If you haven't done so already, and I think there's still a few of you who haven't, you need to email me your assignment from week 2 pronto. And then also, please make sure you're reading the announcements thoroughly. A couple people weren't quite sure about this week if they needed to go and watch the movie or not. All I posted was the assignment for Modern Times and said that I would be putting up the lecture shortly. So if you didn't get to class to watch that, you might want to talk with Denise and arrange a time to get the film. It's on VHS, so it's about 86 minutes, I believe. And so make sure you get that watched this week. Now, as we've been watching the development over the last couple weeks of cinema, we've seen that it has had, from almost the very beginning, a profound influence on our culture. Sometimes this is in positive ways, and sometimes it's in some very negative ways. Some of you commented in our discussion about D.W. Griffith and The Birth of the Nation about how films can be very manipulative, and we, as the audience, need to be careful. We need to be aware of these things. But also, a lot of movies have very subtle influences on us. And I think tonight when we watch, if you haven't already, watch Modern Times, you're going to see that the setting is 1930s, it's a Depression era, and there are some subtle influences in there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But before we get to Charlie Chaplin, I wanted to kind of set the scene for you as we have now moved from about the 1910 to about 1920 and on, that the film industry really began to take on the form that we even know to a certain degree today. As I talked about last week, I believe, how a lot of movie companies moved from New York City out to the West Coast to be away from the MPAA, or the MPCC, I'm blanking out. It's the, the MPPC. Sorry about that. The Motion Picture Patent Company. They wanted to be able to have a little bit more freedom, make movies that they enjoyed more, that the audience would be enjoying more. So they moved to Hollywood and got away from that. They also found that it was an excellent location to shoot movies. There were so many different types of terrain and topography that you can use to set your movies in. So Hollywood really began to develop as an art form. And there were some early gentlemen there, as you saw in Chapter 6 in the, your reading, men like Thomas Ince and Max Sennett, who began 1910, 11, 12, 13, 14, right in that era there, establishing studios that were vertically integrated. Now, what do we mean by that? Or what do I mean? What do we mean when we use that term? Vertically integrated can be used in any sort of business where it's controlled from the top down. It's vertical, and it means that it's integrated and that everything has a chain of command and it's controlled from the top down. And the film industry very quickly developed this structure. It was based on the Industrial Revolution model, the whole automation and factory idea, even made famous by Henry Ford in being able to create the assembly line, and how can we mass produce and get out a lot of products so we can meet the consumer's expectations and make money. And so it's interesting that as that was going on within the culture of business, it definitely influenced Hollywood. And Thomas Ince, and then shortly after Max Sennett, began to build studios that looked like factories. And to this day, you can actually go down to some of these old studios that still exist. Go down to MGM. It's now called Sony Studios, because it used to be Columbia Studios, which bought out MGM Studios, right there in Culver City. And you can see these big buildings, one after the other, that are all in line and and just look like big factory buildings. And the back lots feel like factories. They have cafeterias that you can go to on your lunch break. And some of the other studios like Warner Brothers, same idea. And Paramount Pictures, they all have these big buildings which the sound stages were in, and they felt and looked like factories, and they were operated like factories. The producer or the owner of these facilities, they would have control from the top down. And if you haven't done the reading, please go take a look at Chapter 6. The producer, let's take for example Thomas Ince, with his company, he would say, let's say he had 5 studios, 5 actual sound stages. He would literally be shooting 5 movies at the same time, and he'd have a director for each one, and a writer working with that director. He would have, the various production staff working underneath them to pull it all together. Obviously, the actors and so forth, and they would each be, independent in the sense that they were producing a different movie. But Thomas Ince and some of these studio heads would control it. They would have final say once the movie was edited together. No, I don't like the way it ended. They'll go back and reshoot it. Or I don't like the way this scene was acted. Go back and reshoot that. Or cut this scene. It doesn't make any sense. And so from the top down, it was vertically integrated. And that forms very early in Hollywood and really sets the tone for, as your book says, the next 40 years. I mean, you're going to see this structure exist all the way up until the early 60s. And it's not until then when kind of Hollywood movies aren't really making as much money as they used to, and more independents start coming in to challenge them, that you kind of see that truly strong producer, studio head controlling things start to disintegrate. So that era is known as the studio era, rightly named, also known as the golden era of Hollywood, in the sense that it's during that 40-year time frame, really from I know we're talking about in the 1910s here, the formation of this, but it really kind of comes together with the big studios by the late teens and then on from the 20s through the early 60s there. So some of the greatest movies that were ever made, some movies that we enjoy, were made under these conditions. And if you remember, actors were contracted to certain studios. It wasn't like Brad Pitt was, early part of this year he was in a movie from Universal, and the latter part of this year he's in a movie from DreamWorks, and next year he's going to be in a movie from Paramount. No, actors didn't have that flexibility. They were happy to get a deal with Warner Brothers, and then they would have a 5-picture deal or sometimes a 5-year deal, and they couldn't go make a movie with anybody else. Now, once in a blue moon, somebody like Paramount or another studio could come and say, hey, we need this actor. We need Clark Gable to be in this movie. He's perfect for it. And they would have to pay a handsome sum to get them out of the contract for that time being. They would never break the contract, but allow them to go work in another production. But it made studio a lot of money. I don't know if Clark Gable, I'm sure he made a little extra money doing that. But nonetheless, they were controlled from the top down. And this really kind of established, like I said, the studio structure that Hollywood would have for many decades to come. So we'll go ahead and stop here and pick up in part 2.